The Enlightenment period of philosophy. The Enlightenment period of philosophy is often referred to as modern philosophy. Modern philosophy is characterized by a refocusing of first philosophy. That is, a shift away from metaphysics as the starting point in philosophical reflection and study, and a discourse more about the nature of knowledge, that is, the epistemic term, in reference to theories of knowledge that are sometimes referred to as epistemology. Now, modern philosophy and Enlightenment culture and ideas and concepts were integrated and influenced each other in profound ways. One of the many Enlightenment influences on modern philosophy and its focus on the nature of knowledge as opposed to a metaphysical account of the universe or creation was the Protestant Reformation. That is, the rethinking of our relationship with God as a matter of individual faith and commitment over that of appealing to papal authority and papal relation with God. That is, the Pope's representation with and to God as the primary way to experience one's Christian faith. This had an enormous influence on philosophy as philosophers also began to consider the nature of truth not based on an authoritarian dogma as handed down by church leadership or those philosophers in service to the Catholic Church, but rather, what does our own reason and our own observation tell us about human nature and the world around us? One example of this retrenchment away from the philosophies of the scholastic period was the Copernican Revolution. Before the Copernican Revolution, indeed, the central description of the universe, recall, is that of the sun as the center of, the earth as the center of the universe, with the sun and the planets and the stars and the skies themselves all orbiting the earth. After all, the earth is the center of God's creation, and we are God's chosen. This notion of the universe is often captured by so-called epicycles, that is, the astronomy of Ptolemy, an ancient astronomer from Alexandria, who sought to describe the universe with the earth at the center through an ever complex system of cycles to capture the movement of the lights in the sky. The Copernican Revolution, based on more consistent observation, more precise observation of the night sky, and also the rejection of dogma as preceding analysis, formulated our views of the universe with the Earth not at the center, but understanding the Earth as one more planet orbiting the sun within a solar system of planets, surrounded by other stars with their own planets and moons and their own orbits. And this view of the night sky was far less complex, far more predictable, and thus, in the end, far more successful understanding of the universe. Philosophy was greatly influenced by this view of the universe, and indeed the change from a Ptolemaic astronomy to a Copernican-based, that is, a heliocentric astronomy. And we will circle back to this influence later on in our discussion of modern philosophy. One of the great influences on the Enlightenment period from scientific perspective that also held great sway over certain philosophical discourses was the work of Galileo. Galileo is credited with inventing the telescope and thus providing even sharper, more precise observation of the night sky. He was also one of the first to suggest an understanding of the laws of motion different from those given by Aristotle, and anticipating the eventual work of such physicists as Newton and others. Galileo is also responsible for a famous text, Two World Systems, in which he explores both the dogmatic world system as imposed by the church and the newly contrived world system supported by the work of Kepler and Galileo, even that of Tycho Brahe, the famous astronomer whose work is still regarded as some of the most accurate description of the night sky. Galileo in this work was careful not to prefer one system over another, but of course that did not prevent Galileo's eventual imprisonment and house arrest that under which he eventually died because of church disapproval of his work. Within philosophy, we begin a refocus away from metaphysics and the imposed dogmatic cosmologies of the scholastic period to questions concerning the nature of knowledge, that is, theories of knowledge. Part of this comes from the frustration of having to decipher and decide which of our classical metaphysical accounts of the universe is the true account. Much of this debate can be distilled down to the philosophy of Plato and his idealistic notion of the universe, most notably manifested in his theory of forms, versus Aristotle's more realism account of the universe, most manifested through his writings within the categories and the physics, in which his focus is not on accounting for the universe through ideal concepts, but rather accounting for the analysis of our perceptual experience and how that happens. Descartes is the first philosopher that we will study. Descartes receives credit for the so-called epistemic turn away from metaphysics as first philosophy and toward epistemology, or theory of knowledge, as the central area of philosophical inquiry and discourse. That is, knowledge is understood as being our primary philosophical question that will then form the foundation for determining other philosophical discourses, including that of metaphysics. Epistemology brings with it a number of very interesting questions, many of which we still ask today, and many of which still drive a very robust discourse on these questions of knowledge. Can we know anything? This is the skeptical question. Is it possible to actually know in the sense of being certain about whatever we believe? Or are we left with inherent uncertainty, and we simply do the best we can with what we have? The central question for us, as we explore the major philosophers of the modern period, will be the question of the origins of knowledge. That is, what is the process by which we obtain knowledge? Our two primary answers to those questions are that of rationalism and empiricism. Our first philosopher, Descartes, will argue for a rationalist epistemology in which knowledge is first and foremost the result of the application of reason to our experience. Epistemology also invites questions concerning the relation between truth and knowledge and their natures. How does reality become explained? How do we explain or account for what we regard as reality? And we can consider three different theories of truth. This is not an exhaustive list, but they are considered some of the primary explanations for the nature of truth, and hence the nature of knowledge. Moving on to more questions concerning knowledge and how we are going to enter into this discourse. There are different kinds of acts of knowing. There is, of course, knowledge by acquaintance. We are familiar with our own introspective content, our own beliefs and pains and thoughts. We are also familiar with the world around us, even as we may not give that familiarity a precise account, as it were. Still, the familiarity is certainly present. Then there's competency knowledge. Competency knowledge is a fascinating area of epistemology, as it often manifests itself more by the ability to perform a certain behavior, even as we cannot necessarily give precise description of that behavior or those actions. For example, a major league pitcher clearly is competently knowledgeable of what it is to accurately throw a baseball, and yet probably cannot put into words precisely how that is affected. And in fact, for the sake of his own success at his trade, he may not want to try to put that competency into words. The most important kind of knowledge for us is that of propositional knowledge. Knowledge manifested as statements or propositions, which we can assign a so-called truth value. That is, we can assign them as being either true or false about the subject of the statement or proposition. This is sometimes referred to as knowledge that. I believe that the sky is blue. This is often considered the most specific kind of knowledge. Almost all knowledge has some propositional content to some extent, and thus gives good justification for focusing on propositional knowledge as a central area of epistemology. We also reject the notion of what is sometimes referred to as de re knowledge, that is, the notion that you can know something in an uninterpreted fashion, that it is simply there, present in one's cognition, but is given no sort of interpretation or account. This is going to be our central area of epistemological study. And indeed, propositional knowledge accounts for much of both modern and contemporary epistemologies. This brings us to the definition of knowledge. Just what is knowledge? Since Plato's Theaetetus, at least, and probably before, knowledge has been understood as a justified, true belief. In the Theaetetus, Plato points out that, of course, to know something, you first must believe it. And of course, the expectation is that that belief is true. That is, it's accepted as accurate. But also, as Plato argues, it must have some justification accompanying it. You must have a reason for accepting this belief. That is, Plato argues that you simply cannot luck into a true belief and still count it as knowing. On the notion of skepticism and the question, can we really know anything? This is about both what the truth is and how we come to justify those beliefs that we regard as true. And indeed, in contemporary discourse, since at least the 1960s, the question of justification has become a very important question within contemporary, that is 20th century epistemology. It is worth noting that this kind of skepticism can lead to a kind of global doubt, not just a skepticism about whether we can know certain facts about the world, but the skepticism about whether we can know about the world. That is, whether we should be skeptics or not, we can be skeptical that we could ever even answer that question. This leads to a plethora of interesting questions, such as the question of other minds. How do I know that I have a mind? How do you know that you have a mind? And the most obvious answer to this question is by way of introspection. I'm aware of my own thoughts and feelings. And it's by way of this inner awareness that I can credit myself as having a mind. But now, of course, here's the problem. How can I credit you with having a mind when I cannot use the same process to justify that claim? That is, I cannot use my own introspection to gaze into your thoughts, feelings, your cognition. And hence, it brings up the skeptical question. Is there really such a thing as other minds? And if so, what is the epistemological basis for that claim? Again, this is a fascinating question, and frankly, a wonderful area of epistemological discourse. It is a shame that we simply won't have time this semester to do any work in this particular kind of epistemological question. The skepticism can also lead to doubt about our own nature. It can lead to doubt about the very nature of our own being. How do we know we actually exist as the bodies, the physical manifestation that we believe that we do? Isn't it possible that we are, as one philosopher put it, that of Hilary Putnam, merely brains in a vat? We're simply brains hooked into an electronic system that produces the cognitions and perceptions that inform us of having bodies and experiencing the various characteristics of the world around us. But there's no reality to these perceptions. It's merely electronic impulses fed to our brains. How can we know that that isn't the case? Why would we believe it otherwise? Circling back to the theories of truth I mentioned earlier, the oldest and most intuitive of those theories was that of correspondence theory. And this is merely the explanation that a true proposition simply corresponds to our perceived experience in the world. The sky is blue is true because my eyes tell me the sky is actually blue. I can point to the sky as evidence for the believability, that is the acceptance of that claim. The nice thing about this theory of truth is it presents an objective basis for our knowledge. If someone doubts my claim, we need only, both of us, look at the world around us to confirm or deny that truth. If someone doesn't believe the sky is blue, for example, assuming that he or she is not colorblind, we need only point to the sky to confirm that belief. This, of course, assumes a metaphysical realist position, since the assumption is that there really is a world to which we can confirm and affirm our states of belief. But a central question or challenge to this theory of truth is that of how can we explain how that correspondence is achieved? What exactly is the process for confirming that a belief is actually corresponding to my experience? How does experience, that is, generate that belief? It's not enough simply to say it does. Part of the philosophical enterprise here is to explain how it does. And as Locke and subsequent philosophers have found, that's far more difficult than it initially appears. As a response to some of these challenges, some of the challenges against correspondence theory of truth, some philosophers have instead argued for a coherence theory of truth, in which a proposition is true not because it corresponds to some perceptual or cognitive experience, but rather a proposition is true because it coheres with or is consistent with our entire system of beliefs. A belief gains its acceptability because it works well with the rest of what we believe. This theory leads to a kind of holism, which dictates that no particular belief can be analyzed apart from the entire system of beliefs within which it rests. This typically assumes an anti-realist view of the world in which we simply can't say whether or not the world is actually corresponding to the beliefs we accept, and it really doesn't matter whether the world corresponds or not, in the sense that what's really important is a kind of consistency. And we'll see a version of this kind of theory later in this discussion of modern philosophy. Some objections, however, against coherence theory is that, look, fairy tales can be internally consistent as well, but that doesn't make them at all representative of the universe or our place in that universe. Coherence theory also seems to lack objectivity. That is, since neither of us share our systems of belief, at least not necessarily, why should any of my truths be the same as yours? As long as my truths are internally consistent with the rest of my beliefs, and yours are internally consistent with your system of beliefs, then our truths have the legitimacy that we expect, even as they can easily entirely disagree with each other. And finally, how can we add new truths to a system that only gains acceptability by consistency with already existing truth or belief? That is, how can we gain a new belief that would then be judged as consistent with all other beliefs, since we've already rejected some kind of correspondence to an independent external world? Then there's the pragmatic theory of truth. This theory of truth is the result of 19th century inquiry into the question of how is it that we can talk with some confidence and sensibility of religious truth when religious truths are often inconsistent with many of the other truths that we have and how we acquire them, and are also often inconsistent with or entirely apart from our own perceptual experience of the world around us. In pragmatic theory of truth, or pragmatism, we tend to look at truth not as a correspondence to the world around us or a coherence with other beliefs that we have, but rather as acceptable because of its usefulness or practicality in leading a successful life. This is for the truth of religious belief, in the sense that we often justify our religious beliefs as central to our own understanding of what our lives require to be perceived as a successful life. In this case, we also, however, lose an opportunity to expect objectivity among our accepted beliefs. And in fact, objectivity in this sense is explicitly denied in favor of simply the long-term success of the belief. The longer that we hold, for example, a particular set of religious beliefs, the more acceptability, the more currency they gain. There are many objections against pragmatism. Two of the most important are that of cultural relativism, in which truth in the more global or general sense is sacrificed for the sake of practicality in living one's life. And second, there seems some suggest that there's a truth beyond what's pragmatic, and indeed, it is often considered typical that the pragmatic is subservient to the true understanding of the universe. That is, we want the truth about the universe in order to make practical decisions about our lives. In this sense, we can ask, does pragmatism actually work with our common notions of truth? This is merely a primer for the modern philosophies that we are going to move on to study, beginning with Descartes' philosophy. What's important is to note the influence of philosophy on the Enlightenment ideals and principles, and the influence of those Enlightenment ideals and principles on the development of new lines of philosophical discourse.